Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hi, thank you for being with me today. We're going to talk about what it really takes to produce a cinematic-style audiobook. So this is really moving behind the scenes of a full-cast immersive project for audiobooks. Let's start with the pre-production process, which is a significant portion of what it takes. A lot happens to get the project fully set up. First of all, there's the casting process. What we do at Pro Audio Voices is we have our casting director meet with the author. We will, if the author has already written up some character information, a character list, that is extremely helpful, and we may be asking for that if they haven't already done so. So if you're considering a full cast production for your audiobook, that is a good step to take in advance so you can be prepared. You'll want to identify who are the primary characters, who are those you'd consider secondary, and any others that are important in terms of their role in the story and their dialogue specifically in the story. So many times, if you have a main character or a secondary character who might be secondary in terms of importance, but not in terms of how much they say within the audiobook, then you might downgrade them to tertiary characters. The other thing that's really helpful to know is for those different characters, are there any accents that might be required? What is their cultural background that would impact the casting? So those are some initial questions that go to the author. Also, questions relating things like tone or type of voice. Is this someone that you imagine with a really rough, growly voice, or someone with a soft, light voice, or really nasal, or, what are those qualities that you imagine? And this is also important, that you are committed to. In other words, they're really important to you and the telling of your story, that they fit into those kinds of qualities. If they're just ones that you've imagined, but you don't feel married to, you don't feel like they have to be that, then you can state those as an idea or as a preference, but don't lock it in, because you might find that, and we have had this experience where in the case that I'm thinking of, the author thought, well, I really wanted the actor to have this very specific accent from this very small community segment of New Orleans. Well, when the auditions came in, what he found was that was less important than the storytelling quality, sort of the vibe of the character and the performance ability. And that is, I would always lean towards that higher quality of acting over an accent, unless it is just super, super important to you. So those are some things to consider. All right. What else around the casting needs to happen during that pre-production phase? Well, one is, what will the audition text be? This is where the casting director will assist you or ask for your input on, at the least, as to what scenes would be of a special value to you. Like if you heard the voice of this character in this scene, then you would know if that's the right guy for you or the right, actor for you. That is helpful information. remember that when we send out audition calls, it is to everyone's advantage to keep the audition text shorter rather than longer. Having 10 minutes of somebody doing a scene is not helpful. You might think it is. Perhaps it would be to you, but really what then happens is, first of all, you're going to reduce the number of people who will even audition because it's a lot of work for just a maybe, just for sending an audition. And the other is that then you can get kind of locked into one voice, and then to go try to compare it to another one, it's a lot of extra listening for you. And I think it changes the way we can hear what those audition options are. So we keep it tight in terms of the audition text. Typically, a couple minutes would be about as much as we would want for an audition. And then there will also be the question of which scenes, so the audition text might vary depending on the roles that they're auditioning for, and that's totally fine. Again, you'll want to keep them typically fairly short. Then the casting calls go out, and the next phase is largely around figuring out which voices are going to take on which set of characters. As I mentioned in an earlier episode about full cast projects, that typically you'll have actors who will be reading multiple roles, although the primary characters in the audiobook, we try to keep that just with one voice and just have that be the only character they're doing when that's possible. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes they'll pick up an extra character or two along the way, but that's sort of an optimal scenario. So then it's matching all of those different voices up. Sometimes it means rearranging the tracks or the set of characters that will be voiced by one particular actor. One character might be moved over into a different track, so it would be done by a different character. A lot of sort of zhuzhing around, a lot of these adjustments once we actually get the auditions in and we're starting to place people into tracks or sets of characters. And then there's the element of scheduling. Scheduling is something that typically happens right at the very beginning of production, but the pre-production phase, there is some impact here as well, because if, for example, we want a couple readers or actors to be in the same scene and their calendars completely are misaligned so that doesn't seem possible, that could be a factor in the casting itself. So it really depends. But these are all things that need to be looked at. At the same time, another piece, and a lot of this happens during the manuscript preparation, the manuscript is split up so that we can be most efficient with everyone's time and group scenes of conversation into recording sessions. And then we will create a kind of what I call a recording map, where we are grouping together the same actors that are in multiple scenes spread out throughout the audiobook, bring those together into a session. And then we're looking at how efficient can we be with those. And that is also then helping to clarify what the scope and the eventual cost of the audiobook will be. So we're looking at those different tracks of characters that each actor will play and how those all fit together. It's a lot of very complex detail that goes into the pre-production for an audiobook, a full cast immersive audiobook. There is another aspect of the script adaptation or preparation, and that is about attributions. Attributions are those things, like he said, she said, or sometimes it might be more extended, like he said as he put the knife on the table. In an audiobook, it's going to sound with a full cast where you have some voice doing that line. It's a better listening experience. If, let's say, it's like instead of he said as he put the knife on the table, you would hear the line and then he put the knife on the table. Or it might be the name of the character, put the knife on the table. In this way, we're indicating without employing the he said, she saids, we're indicating who it is that's speaking. The voice itself is a part of that, obviously. Being distinctive is helpful. We're also looking at things like at the beginning of the audiobook, the listener is not going to be able to immediately remember, oh, that's the voice of X character. That, especially if you have more than two people conversing in a scene, we need to create the ways and means in the text so that the listener is going to be able to not lose track of who's who, that they can follow along with the story and not get confused. And so that is a real sort of, that's not a science. That's more like an art when it comes to that manuscript preparation. So these, again, are things that we're looking at, as well as are there opportunities, especially in the front matter, the back matter, are there opportunities to help with the marketing of the audiobook later? And that might be things like visiting the author's website to hear the rest of an interview, a bonus interview, that kind of thing. We're looking for those things as well because we want all of that to be in place before we head into production. Let's just take a short pause. We'll come right back and we'll get into that next phase, that production phase of producing a full cast immersive audiobook.
Do you have a book that you imagine with multiple voices, or a screenplay or stage play? At Pro Audio Voices, we love working on these more complex productions with music and sound effects and a full cast of voices. Bringing together decades of experience in both theatre and audio production, our team brings your project to life. From manuscript preparation, to casting, to directing the actors, and a post-production team to bring it all together, Pro Audio Voices brings your project to life. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com/full-cast.
Okay, so as we complete pre-production, we start moving into the production phase. What's involved? First of all, getting all of those actors, however many there are, getting all of those actors' schedules lined up for recording sessions with the director and the session manager. That is always a complicated thing because everyone has busy lives and we're all doing our best to make things work across typically at least 3 time zones, sometimes even more, sometimes considerably more. We've done audiobooks with actors from the Pacific West Coast, Pacific time zone, all the way through multiple time zones, including all the way to India. And so, as you can imagine, trying to get all of those lined up during working hours is tricky. So that is step number 1. As we get those lined up and then we get those sessions recorded, what we're doing is we're recording the dialogue in session so that we have that genuine interaction between actors playing different characters. It's what I consider our secret sauce. It is really makes a difference in terms of the end result and the excellence of the product at the end. There is another step before we get into the actual recording, and that is because of the fact that each actor is recording remotely, they're each going to have their own studio, their own mic, their own setup, and that impacts what we call the room tone, as well as just the recording qualities, the technical specifications, as well as the recording quality for each specific actor. Now, when we pull all of the recordings together into a single audiobook, we don't want it to sound like they're all in different places, obviously. We want to get as close as possible to it sounding like we were all in the same studio at the same time. How do we do that? Step number one is we have each person who has been cast needs to send in some audio that we use to evaluate their audio setup. There may be adjustments either in their gain, their volume, or other elements that the audio engineer might recommend to get it as close as possible so that they all match up as close as we can get prior to the recording. When we go into the process of recording with that level of attention, it makes the post-production process much easier as well as much more effective in terms of getting that consistent sound. Then as we're moving into recording sessions, we are typically always jumping around through the manuscript, which is challenging for everyone, although it's really critical for the efficiency of and not having actors just sitting around waiting until their line comes up. And also, related to that is the cost of the project would significantly rise if we had to take that approach. So we're jumping around within the manuscript. That's also affected by availability, scheduling. So when we're doing that, we need to make sure as we come into each scene that we all know what's going on, what this scene is coming off of, and where it is leading into. So then we'll do that recording, and those are directed sessions. So any line that is either inaccurate or needs something more or a different take, those are all things that the director will call out, will address right in those sessions. And then we need to pull all of that audio together with the solo recorded narration that has been done by either if there's a single main narrator or if there are multiple points of view of narration throughout the audiobook. When we're pulling those together, initially there is a rough cut. Basically, it's getting everybody's audio lined up, and then it moves on to the voiceover editing, which is reviewed by the author. And just to make sure that we got all the attitudes and tones accurately, and if there's any adjustments that they would like or any pickups, any corrections that need to happen, there's always something. There's always something. That's okay. That's just part of it. And then we'll get those handled. And then once the voiceover is done, we move into that immersive sound design. This is where it gets, I think, each layer, each level sort of gets a little bit more exciting as we approach the finish line with a project. So the immersive sound design, typically the author and the sound designer have had at least a brief meeting to get on the same page with the vibe that we're going for, the kind of, if there's music involved, whether, what that style is. And many times with full cast audiobooks, we do utilize music. It's a great tool for, just as with film, a great tool for supporting the emotional message, sort of helping with that undercurrent of emotion. Yeah, as the listener, listening to, let's say, like an increasingly tense scene, you might have like a single or a discordant, two discordant notes that really help us know just subconsciously, there's something really intense going on here. So that's one way that music can be used. It can also be used to, let's say, for example, in a battle scene where the soundtrack could get incredibly intense in terms of all the sounds of battle, which sometimes is appropriate, sometimes less so. It really depends on the story and how it plays out. Because, for example, if you are going in and out of the battle scene and there's narrative in between, one way it might help to have the soundtrack holding on to that battle scene, or it might be weird. So it might be weird to sort of go in and out of that, in which case you might want a piece of music that is going to tie that all together nicely. Again, it always depends on the specific, unique project, but that is some of the work that then happens. In terms of the music, there is that in itself is significant because there is this sourcing process, which means going through a whole bunch of music that we can easily license, that is from a library, that is going to be that where we're trying to find just the right fit. That can be really challenging. It can also be very time-consuming. Alternatively, sometimes music is composed specifically for an audiobook or different scenes, and many times it can be a combination of those, sourcing for some places and composition for other places. Sometimes there will be a sort of ambience, atmospheric kind of sound, the sound of the forest, the sound of the river, those kinds of things that are in play. And then sometimes we have transition sounds. So there may be music, there may be atmospheric sounds that are layered in, and then there may be specific sound effects for things like, sword clash or dropping something or any number of footsteps, any number of things that could happen within the flow of the storyline. All right, so then all of that gets placed, and then the author reviews again. Now they've listened to the narration. Now they're listening just for the soundtrack, sound design element of that. It is important in the approval of the voiceover narration portion of the project to make sure that that is complete. So coming back later afterwards and going, oh, I didn't catch that. Can we change that, what that actor says? That is, it can be done, yes, but it's going to add cost because we are providing that review period to make sure that those things don't happen. And to be fair, if you didn't catch it the first time, maybe it's not as big a deal as, maybe it's not a big enough deal to change. Or maybe it is. That's okay. But just making you aware that the overall flow of the process, that there are these review points, and when we pass those review points, going back a phase does end up incurring additional cost. All right. Once you've reviewed the full audiobook, sometimes there are things like adjusting the levels in the mix. Maybe the music sounds a little too loud or too soft to you, or a particular sound effect doesn't sound quite right. This is an area where it's important to understand, and this is one of our challenges in the audiobook world, is it's important to understand that depending on how somebody listens to the audiobook, what device they're listening on, if they're listening with headphones or earbuds or on their laptop or whatever the way the device, and we have no control over that, how somebody listens, depending on how what their device is going to impact the sound of that mix. Aggravating, annoying, but true. And so we want to be aware of that as you're asking for adjustments in the mix. We want to be sensitive to that fact. And that's something that the sound designer the engineer who is doing that mix should be giving, you may get pushback on your request for a change. Just be aware that they have the understanding of the differences of devices, and they're trying to find the best mix with that understanding, trying to find the level of mix that is going to deliver the best experience for the most listeners. Yeah, it's an annoying thing, but that's just reality. I will say, if you are an audiobook listener and you love full cast projects, then generally I would say listen in stereo, like just put on headphones or earbuds, but some way that you can actually hear it in stereo. It can make a huge difference in how you listen or in how you experience the audiobook, how you experience the ambience and the sound effects. Because sometimes those stereo effects will come into play and it sounds different. So, so that's an important thing, I think, to know. And then it's helpful to let your listeners know as best you can. So put it in the book description, at the end. Say, hey, listen with stereo headphones because it's going to, improve your experience. Okay, and then, once it's completely done and approved and heading into distribution, we always encourage you to include it on Amplify Audiobooks as a distribution platform because you're going to get your very best experience there, as will your listeners, because you can not only earn way more per audiobook sale, but you will also be able to know who your customers are and to engage with them and to leverage the fact that you've got that full cast of actors who are also really, generally excited about helping to spread the word. So you can all work together as a team on Amplify Audiobooks and collaborate to the audiobooks and your success. Thank you so much for joining me today and talking about full cast audiobooks and sort of the process behind those. I hope that you will join us on amplifyaudiobooks.com, regardless of whether you are an author, a narrator, a listener, whoever you are in the world. I hope that you'll join us there because there's some amazing community happening and opportunities there to grow together around the shared experiences of audiobooks. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. Catch you on the next episode. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.